It is wonderful to see everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Empty Nesters Book Club book discussion. As many of you know, I'm Rabbi Sue Shankman. I look forward to this morning's presentation, which we bring you in partnership with the Jewish Book Council. Daniel Levin is the son of a diplomat and spent his early years in the Middle East and in Africa, and then trained as a lawyer. Currently a board member of the Liechtenstein Foundation for State Governance, he has, for the past 20 years, worked with governments and development institutions worldwide, focusing on economic development and political reform through financial literacy, political inclusion, and constitutional initiatives. He is also engaged in Track 3 diplomacy and mediation efforts in war zones. Levin's first book, Nothing But a Circus, Misadventures Among the Powerful, was published in Germany, Japan, Russia, and the UK. Proof of Life is his first book to be published in the United States. He lives outside New York City, where the weather at this moment is exactly the same as it is for us. As he said, for those of you who already heard, it is book club weather. And we are so delighted to have you with us this morning to share with our empty nesters, and look forward to your presentation. So Mr. Levin will be sharing a bit about his background in the book, and then we will move to some Q&A. I know people already have sent me some questions, and looking forward to our conversation this morning. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thanks everyone for having me. I'll start with the book and then give you just a little bit of information on myself that the Rabbi didn't cover in the kind introduction. But just maybe just as a prologue to what I'm going to say, I was born in Israel in 1963. For those of you who are trying to place me and place my accent and everything else, I'm just giving that a little bit of background, and I can put a little more context on it later. The book's called Proof of Life. It details my efforts in late 2014 to find a person who had gone missing in Syria. I'll give also on this a little bit of background, why that even came about, and how that is placed in the context of my work, so that it might be a little more interesting. And then as we go through the plot of the book, I'll obviously try to steer clear of spoilers, but nonetheless give you a sense of this, of what transpired over these 20 days. So I run a foundation in Europe, as was mentioned in the introduction, and the point of this foundation, it's a non-for-profit foundation founded by a European monarch, head of state, the Prince of Liechtenstein, who started this in 2008, 2009, and the point of the foundation was to work in failed states in war zones, otherwise economically failed states all over the world. Unfortunately, we don't have any shortfall of failed states these days. And rather than go through this the way the traditional approach of development has been in NGOs, of trying to import solutions and models and funding that have worked in other countries, our approach of the foundation has been to identify young people, next generation potential leaders, and take them out of the country while the civil wars are raging, and prepare them for future leadership position. If we're lucky, we get to work with 50 people. Sometimes it's a much smaller group, such as 15 people. And that's somewhat of the context for this work in Syria and how this came about. We were asked right after the civil war exploded, in connection with the Arab Spring that raged all over North Africa and the Middle East. We were asked in 2012 by all the parties in Syria to help mediate the conflict. And at the time, it wasn't clear at all the Assad regime would emerge as unscathed or victoriously as it has, for reasons that we can go into later. It was unclear really how it would all work out. This was before the Russian intervention in 2015 that tipped the war in Assad's favor. So early in this conflict, what had happened was that there were demonstrations mainly against the rise in food prices and wheat prices, which instead of dealing with it intelligently, the Assad regime just responded with this unbelievable brutality, beat to death young children, and that in turn created this massive uprising against the regime. It was then obviously viewed in the context of the overall Arab Spring, but in each Arab Spring country, from Tunisia to Egypt to Syria, Lebanon, it always was a little bit different. We then got involved, and our condition was we would be willing to mediate between the sides, and our foundation does mediate in war zones and also between parties, including on Israel's behalf in several cases. We said that the condition for our involvement in mediating would be that all the sides to the war, the regimes, the Free Syria Army, all the various religious groups, from the Shiites to the Sunnis to the Christians to the Druze, that they would give us young members of their community who were uncorrupted and untainted by the violence that was going on, and allow them to go outside the country and work with our trainers and prepare them for leadership when the killing one day would hopefully end. And we did this for about a year and a half, 2012 until mid-2013, until it became clear, especially on the regime side, that they're really just paying lip service, and they were actually undermining this whole process. And so we ended it. But as a result of the work that we had done, we developed a network in Syria to most of the power centers in the country, both in different physical parts of the country and also in different tribes and ethnic groups and political centers. And that in turn led to being approached by several families and governments when people went missing, from journalists to aid workers to doctors who had been abducted, primarily Westerners, also to Japanese individuals. And they approached us to see if we could help, first of all, locate them, then deliver proof of life, and then, if possible, and if the person was alive, to negotiate their release. And that was the context for the story that I recorded in this book called Proof of Life. Now, in 2014 was an especially brutal year. It was the year of the rise of Islamists in Syria. It was the year, if you recall, of these terribly gruesome executions, actually beheadings of James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, and others in the fall of 2014. And I had sworn to myself that I'm never going to get again involved in a hostage situation in Syria. I had just returned in fall of 2014 from a failed negotiation where I had spent 6 months delivering proof of life and negotiating with the kidnappers. It was an Islamist group, and a week before the handover was supposed to take place, the group executed the hostage. I was really traumatized by it, returned to the US and swore to myself and to my family that I'm done with hostage negotiations in Syria. It was at this point really not something I could effectively help with, because the executions were really done for recruitment purposes, especially by the Islamist parties. And to the extent the government had hostages, they never admitted to having them. And so there was really no way to be helpful to the families. And I was essentially tricked into a conversation about this particular hostage. I was asked by an acquaintance to meet him in Paris in a life or death matter. He was very melodramatic how he said it. He didn't indicate that it was Syria. I met him for dinner, and he basically, on a walk after dinner in Paris, broke down and told me that a very close friend of his had a son who had disappeared in Syria, and asked me, pleaded really desperately to get involved. He had struck out with all the various traditional sources for help, intelligence agency, other networks, NGOs that were active in the country, and he really didn't know where to turn anymore. And he really just broke down. I promised to make a call, and I called a dear friend of mine called Khalid Al-Maghi. He's a Saudi, born Saudi father, Syrian mother, as he jokes, like Osama bin Laden. And he's usually my first point of reference in all matters related to Syria and also other countries in the Middle East, because he's that well connected. And there are many cases where he's told me, don't even touch that one, for a whole range of reasons. Sometimes because the person's already been executed, or because there are ransoms being negotiated and we can't really get involved with ransom payments. But in this case, he said that if I wanted to help here and try and find a solution, that I would have to come meet him in Istanbul. And then if he got the green light, he would send me to Beirut for a meeting with the head of a major Lebanese militia that I promised to use pseudonym for, but a person well known to the US and to Israel, has also been sanctioned by the US and by the European Union. And that person would then direct me to the trail of the missing person. The missing person was a young man in his 20s, a very naive Westerner, and it wasn't quite clear to me why he had gone into Syria. He wasn't a journalist, wasn't an aid worker, no one had sent him. I describe in the book the little bit that I knew about him. For a moment, I had a suspicion that he was there for unsavory reasons. Those turned out not to be true. And I ended up traveling to Beirut for that night, and finding out essentially that this young person had been taken a captive by a drug gang, the most notorious gang of Syrians that deal in everything from drugs to weapons to people, of course, both hostages as well as young girls that are taken from villages, teenage girls that are taken from villages in Syria and sold into sex slavery all over the Arab world, particularly the Arabian Persian Gulf, Dubai, Saudi Arabia. And that was the gang that had captured this young man. And from that moment in Beirut, I was on the hunt essentially to catch up with the leader of that gang and see if he would in any way provide me with information on this person. Ended up missing him by actually just a few hours in Amman, Jordan, and then ultimately ended up catching up with him in Dubai. And so that's, I think, the extent of what I want to reveal on the hardcore plot of the story. In Dubai, in order to meet him, I had to go through his former wife, who was a character in her own right, and had to enter a Faustian bargain with her that in exchange for information she would give me on how to find her ex-husband, I would have to help her and her daughter leave Dubai into a Western European country. And I also encountered two young girls, teenage girls at the time, now young women in their 20s, who were taken from a village in Syria, sold into sex slavery, and at great personal risk to their own lives, helped me find this gang leader and let me catch up with him too. And those two young girls ultimately were able to take out of Dubai and bring to a Western European country and provide them with a new identity. And actually, the younger of the two just celebrated a birthday, her 22nd birthday, just a week ago. So very much still in my life today. So I'm just framing the story with all that before I give you a little bit more context. One of them is that the drug that this gang, the primary drug, they were also trading in heroin and LSD and everything, but the primary drug that they were manufacturing and distributing is an amphetamine called Captagon. Some of you may have heard about it or read about it in the newspaper. It's been covered recently in the press. Syria has become this unbelievable manufacturing lab for Captagon, which has a huge advantage for the manufacturers that it's very cheap to do. If you have a high school chemistry kit and some water and a scale, you can manufacture Captagon. It's created an epidemic of unspeakable proportions, primarily in the Arab world, but now more increasingly in Southern Europe, in Spain and Greece, and making its way up to Northern Europe. It's a very insidious amphetamine. The dealers often sell it in blister packs to make it look like ADHD medication. It's something that was actually developed in the 1960s in Germany. Not entirely surprising, since Germany seems to specialize in developing amphetamines for war use. For those of you interested, actually in the Second World War, Germany developed a drug called Pervitine, which was used as an amphetamine that allowed the Wehrmacht soldier and the SS to travel and fight for 4, 5, 6 days straight without any sleep, which was the basis for the Blitzkrieg when Germany took in Western Europe. And Captagon's a very similar amphetamine with very similar properties, was developed in the 60s and then taken out of, banned entirely by the medical professional in the 70s and 80s because of its insidious side effects and the toxicity it causes in the heart and in the blood. But this drug is very much still an extremely dangerous matter, and it's also something that's sustaining the Syrian war economy because the profits are so astronomical, and as long as the few parties to this war can continue to make these kind of astronomical profits, obviously this war can continue without any interruption, probably until there's simply no more people to kill in Syria. So I want to leave some of this also for a discussion later in terms of putting Syria in the context of the larger Middle East and the outside parties that keep the war alive. So I don't want to overtalk this issue if it's not what all of you listening in today are interested in talking. I'll just give you a little bit of background on myself here so that it places into the story. I was born in 1963 in Israel. I'm 58 years old today. My mom is from the Italian part of Switzerland. My dad is one of the founding generations of Israel, was a member of the Palmach in the 40s, got severely injured just 10 days before the Day of Independence in 1948. Got his whole left side blown off, lost his left arm, was sent to the States for a few years to recover, was in the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, then went back and entered into Israeli politics, was very close with Ben-Gurion and with Dayan, with the Labor Party in the kibbutz movement, and ended up as a young Israeli diplomat, first in Cyprus, where I was conceived in 1962. That's at least what my parents have told me. He was very involved in the Cypriot and Greek civil wars, was close to Archbishop Makarios, which came in handy later in some of the work in Syria also, because the people who helped me were often Syrian Christians who were in absolute admiration for Archbishop Makarios. Then my family moved in the mid-60s to Kenya, where my dad was Israeli ambassador for East Africa. My sister was born there. She has a Swahili name called Malaika. And I spoke Swahili as a little boy, which helped me later learn Arabic, because Swahili has Arabic roots. We were there during the Six-Day War in 1967. It's where my dad started to ask his colleagues, Golda and Dayan and Ezer Weizmann and that generation of Israeli leaders to, his position was that this would be a time to negotiate with the Palestinians. He was shot down, claiming that, first of all, the Khartoum resolution made that negotiation useless. And secondly, Golda famously, as you all know, claimed that there was no Palestinian people, they're just all Jordanians. And he was so disgusted that in late 69, when we went back to Israel, he decided to leave politics and then actually also leave Israel in 1970 and then moved to Switzerland. So I'm just giving you a little bit of my background. It's pretty nomadic. I grew up then in Switzerland, came to the States after high school for a year for a combination of yeshiva and martial arts tournaments that didn't work out too well, either one of those careers, I would say. And then went back to Switzerland, studied law. And in 1988, went to Israel. I was thinking I was going to do an academic career, did a PhD in law, basically on examining Jewish law and Sharia law for its role of treatment of women, in particular the disparity of treatment of men and women and how a secular judge would have to judge it. And I thought I was going to have an academic career in that area. And then abandoned that because I had a chance to clerk at the Supreme Court, got involved in the Ivan the Terrible appeal to the Supreme Court at the time, and then ended up serving in the Israeli army because I was an Israeli born, and ended up in special forces in the first Gulf War, serving for a while, and then refused to serve in the occupied territories, and then decided to leave Israel in 1992 and come to the States. So there's a whole lot of random nomadic choices, devoid of any kind of career strategy, I will say. But it landed me in the States. I did a postdoc here, and then I always thought I might at some point go back to Israel to teach in law, but had an opportunity to work here, and it got me into development work. And because I'd grown up in Africa and a lot of friends still from Africa I'd gone to school with, the current president of Kenya, for example, Uhuru Kenyatta, someone I went to kindergarten with, he actually spent a few months in the Israeli kindergarten in Nairobi, funnily enough. And so we became friends. So those kinds of contacts started my work in development in the 90s, and which in turn then led to the founding of this non-for-profit foundation. So I'm just giving you an overview, not so much to brag about some brilliant career path, but rather to show you how random it's all been, not really very thought out. But I then find myself an Israeli born in Syria, currently in Yemen. We're very active in Libya right now. And this kind of work, sometimes just incredulous of just how this makes any kind of sense whatsoever. But it really is that old Yiddish saying that man plans and God laughs, I suppose. And so, with all that, I'm happy to keep on talking about the book and my context, but I think it would be probably more interesting to you to have a chance to go at me or ask me any questions or clarifications and make this more dynamic, unless Rabbi, I leave it also up to you to steer this.
So I know there are a number of questions already, and I think there is, again, this is so outside the purview of what many of us do on a day-to-day basis. If we are concerned about the safety of driving in DC traffic, especially with today's weather, down to Temple, it's nothing compared to the places in which you've found yourself, and especially in thinking about in the story, and as you shared earlier, the women you've helped and others who you've worked to save. So given a lot of the sensitivities and certainly issues of security, et cetera, why write this book? You know, you're doing all of this incredible work, and some of it not for the purpose of your own acclaim, but why share these stories and share them in such a public way, even protecting the identities of those who need their identities to be kept safe?
Before I answer that, I will say that I just landed back in New York last night, and I think driving in New York is probably as close as you can get to a war zone. My return back from JFK last night.
I learned how to drive in New York City, so I actually do sort of feel like I could drive anywhere in the world after, you know, competing with the taxis in New York. But yes, I can imagine.
So to your question, the first answer and the most direct and honest one, which I describe in the book, is that the older of the two, at the time young girls, now young women, asked me to tell their story. They really helped me at taking huge personal risks, especially the older of the two. I bumped into them in one of those hideous bars, establishments, brothels, where I was looking for this gang leader, and the younger of the two was being dragged by her hair across the floor. And I ended up in an altercation with the person who was doing it. And then her older sister came up to thank me afterwards while I was waiting for a taxi back to my hotel. And we ended up in a conversation. And she then promised to alert me when this gang leader, who was essentially the pimp who had abducted her from her village, when he'd be back in town. And she took a risk by alerting me that could have easily resulted in her death. And when I asked her at the end what it is I could do for her to show my gratitude, all she wanted is for her story to be told. She really didn't want to be effaced out of reality just through the insignificance of her life and the tragedy of her life. And in the end, we became friends. She's really, I consider her part of my family, the older one of the two. But at the time, I literally started to write this book that night. The last night of these 20 days that I write about, I took pen and paper under the sky in a restaurant in Dubai in the middle of the night and started to write it down. I really was to honor her wish. And that's the primary answer to your question. I think beyond that, the reason I wrote the book this way, rather than just, for example, an article or give an interview to tell her story, the reason I chose to write this book was, I suppose it's my goodbye to all that, to some extent. Is that Robert Graves wrote this unbelievable book, memoir in the First World War, called Goodbye to All That. And I think this is the equivalent for me. It was my way of shutting the door. Syria had been a source of so many nightmares. It still is for me a source of so many nightmares. And essentially the safest way to make sure I don't get pulled back into Syria was by poisoning the well, in the sense that it's now evident to anybody that I don't really have access to the regime anymore in Syria, because I name and shame the regime. In the book, I provide pseudonyms for the victims at their request, but I name any perpetrator and any member of the regime, any butcher, I name them by their real names. So obviously that ends any kind of mediation role that I can play in Syria. And for me, that was the only way I could, in my desperation, really make sure that those requests stopped. And after 2014, there were a few more requests, and eventually they really did also stop. So that's, I think, on a deeper level, why I decided to write the book in this way that I wrote.
Thank you. It's amazing. And you did describe the times it was clearly very difficult to be in some of those situations with some of what you were witnessing. Certainly the two young women and that episode and that scene, but others as well that you described, that you in the story, and it's not just a story, but in this experience, you certainly met and obtained information from some really brutal, disgusting people. And this is not just me. I know you describe them that way. Drug dealers, terrorists, etc., human traffickers. How did you keep your sanity? I know that you recorded some of that and expressed some of that for those of us reading it, but how did you keep your sanity? How not only how did you keep your sanity, but how did you also manage to bring the tools that you clearly have and the skills as a hostage negotiator, but also in being able to deal with some of these people in so smoothly, at least from what we read? What are some of those skills, and how did you obtain those or learn some of those?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I did keep my sanity, so I wish that would be a simple answer to your question. The effects of all these experiences I still feel today. The most important premise for me, or assumption, before doing any work of this nature is something I write in the book that a mentor of mine once told me, which is, if you're in a room playing poker and you look around and you can't figure out who the sucker is, chances are it's you. In other words, this fatal mistake that people make in this kind of a situation is to just assume that they can play the player and that they're just a little bit smarter than everyone else. And that's usually that kind of hubris that leads to downfall. Whereas I go into these situations, first of all, knowing full well that I'm going to strike out a lot, that you're going to fail a lot, and you're not going to get directly what you want. And that I'm going in particular in a hostage situation, in a war zone, going in without much leverage. And that means that for me to be able to get anything, even just information on whether someone's alive, let alone proof of life, let alone negotiating a release, for me to be able to do that, I need to have a web of relationships and a web of favors and counter favors that have to work out. So to give an example, if I know that a group has a Western hostage in Syria, and I know which group it is, I can't just, book an appointment like with a Swiss watchmaker and show up there and say, let's just discuss what we can do for each other. It never really works that way. I have to then find out who the group is. I have to find out who's connected to that group, who has any kind of leverage over the group, and then figure out how you can start cashing chips. So in order to cash chips, you have to first have collected chips. So one of the most important lessons when you're working in a war zone in this area is that if you haven't established all those networks of favors and relationships prior to this work, you're not going to be able to do this work. It's a little bit like a surgeon. If you're going to operate on someone, you have to stick the infusion before you start the surgery. If you wait for the surgery, the blood pressure will have dropped already and you can't find the veins. So all that's the equivalent in that analogy of sticking the infusion has to happen years, sometimes decades in advance. I'll give you one example that's deeply personal to me here. And I couldn't write about it too much in the book because I made a promise not to write about it, but there is a Syrian officer who is very much in my life today, who is someone I met in 1991 when I was leading an Israeli army unit in the Golan Heights, and there was a Syrian unit, this is 30 years ago to the year, a Syrian unit that had inadvertently crossed into Israeli territory in the Heights, and near the place called Gamla, actually, where they make that wine, where there was an event of mass suicide, probably a little more interesting than Masada, actually, in Jewish history. We ended up capturing this unit of 12 Syrian soldiers, and he was their commanding officer, and ended up having to debrief him, and the decision was made to just escort them back into Syria without any major fanfare for a number of military reasons, including not wanting to divulge the fact that there was a flaw in the Israeli border. And he and I stayed in touch for many years, and to this day, and he was able to help me. There was a moment where a member of his family was sick, and because his family members were sanctioned, they couldn't travel abroad for medical treatment, and I was able to arrange for chemotherapy in Germany for this family member. And that's the kind of favor that you do that then leads to a counter favor. And so you repeat this in many, many moments, and it's often not direct. So it's not a linear or binary situation. So It's not like I have all these relationships with hostage takers, but it's through networks of people. So if you put it back to what I said earlier about the foundation's work, you end up meeting a lot of people and you develop these relationships. It's not a matter of just speaking the same language or liking their food. It's also a matter of getting to know the families a little bit better and seeing, oh, the son really likes Eminem. And then you send him some Eminem CDs or something like that. This is something that you build over years that you then need to be able to go back to when you're trying to ask for favors. And it's these kinds of networks that led it. So it's first of all understanding that to go into these hostage situations with any kind of arrogance that we can outsmart someone or outpower someone is a little bit silly. There's very little to teach people who are surviving in war zones in terms of value and money and survival and deadly instincts. So it is a certain kind of helplessness, I would say, that characterizes my work there far more than any kind of devilish Machiavellian strategy. But it's disarming when you are clear about that helplessness and you just try and figure out how you can do these kinds of favors. And so I think that gives you a much more accurate flavor of what I do than some kind of a Jason Bourne kind of caricature, because it's none of that whatsoever.
Well, so much of it seems predicated on relationships and those connections. And one of our participants asked and is curious why you were so moved to help find this particular young man after you had already resolved to cease involvement, especially after the previous experience with finding missing people. And what was it about the person who requested your help that made it compelling to you to get involved despite the risk to your own safety? And as a follow-up, and I can hold off on this or I can repeat it again later, but someone else asked if by naming the real names of the players in Syria, are you still at personal risk for retribution? How are you protecting yourself?
Okay, so the first question, why did I get involved? I mean, I don't want to give a flippant answer and say that I asked myself the same question, because I really revisited that decision many, many times, not only throughout these 20 days, but since. It's very hard to explain when a person is that desperate and you have any kind of ability to help. And we can get into the nuances of my own psychology here, and I don't want to bore you with introspection that interests no one other than myself, but there is a moment where I almost look for someone else to tell me that I shouldn't be doing it. So I mentioned this friend Khalid Al-Mari earlier, and he's usually, when it comes certainly to Syria, the first person I call. And there's something in me where I desperately want him to tell me not to touch this case, because I know how much heartbreak is involved in most cases, and almost every hostage situation has an unhappy ending. We just have to understand that. So there are times where the best thing I can do is actually bring the family proof that the person they're waiting for is no longer alive. That's as good as it gets in some instances. So these aren't celebratory occasions, but there's also something that, at least in my case, becomes very hard when you do get drawn in. It's a reason why I try to get briefed by my staff rather than by the families of the missing person. Once you establish a personal relationship with the families, it's just extremely hard to say no when a son, usually it's a son, in some cases an American called Kayla Muller, who was executed by the head of ISIS in early 2015, but usually it's men. And it's something just unbelievably devastating to witness that heartbreak of families, usually parents, spouses, children sometimes, of missing people. And when I am hooked that way, to use a transactional term, but when I do feel connected to the family, it's just very hard to walk away in cases where I feel like there's any chance I can help. And I often don't think that the help I can provide is bring back the person that they're looking for. I really sometimes believe that the best they can hope for is to get some kind of certainty of what happened. Because it is the hardest thing of all is really just sitting there and waiting. And there are families, including American families, who've been waiting, even just in Syria, for 9 years already, for information on their loved ones. So to the extent that I get drawn in by a family member, and the person here who had asked me was as close to family member as you can imagine. It's just almost impossible to walk away. I still hoped that there would be a reason not to get involved, but in the end, there was no such reason really. I had a shot of getting at least some information in this case. In this particular case, so with this gentleman, there was perhaps a way that he might have manipulated me years earlier by displaying, which I describe in the book. I'm not going to get into it too much now, but sort of an act of being virtuous that may have been done also for him, essentially, to collect the chip, that if he ever needed my help on something, that he would be able to come. I know that sounds super devilish and perhaps a little paranoid, but as the saying goes, it's not paranoia if they're really after you, I suppose, right? So that's, I think, the straightest answer I can give without becoming, too mushy, I suppose, on this particular issue. On your second question, I certainly am very careful about my safety. There are parts in the Middle East or other parts of the world I don't travel to, and then there are others I don't travel to without security or unarmed. If I get asked to go, for example, in the past, if I was asked to go to the northeast of Syria, I refused to go to Raqqa and those areas that were simply too dangerous. Same thing when it comes to parts of Iran or Yemen that I just can't travel to. So I do draw certain lines. I can't say that they're always the right lines. I mean, by the fact that we're sitting here together, so far have been, okay, the right lines, but maybe that's just more luck than anything else. But I'm fairly careful in terms of security, and the most important security measure I take is to refuse to do something or go somewhere. And then in another context, obviously, in making sure that that I understand the risks involved. And throughout this book, especially towards the end of the book, when I catch up with this gang leader, I do talk about escape plans and backup plans that I need to do, and meeting people in plain sight with other people around, and those kinds of measures are important. I don't worry about my safety here, but I've also made certain choices not to do or not to get involved in certain things, also out of responsibility for my family and for myself.
Thank you. One of the things that, in addition to some of the security measures and strategies in terms of exit strategies that you talked about in the book, you also talked about the fact that when possible, you certainly took notes in the places where you were able to take notes, and also using your phone for recording. And there were a couple of key times that you perhaps were not able to use the phone. And one of the questions that came from one of our readers was that apparently without a recording, you were able to capture your talks with the sheikh in such detail. And the question is, how are you able to do that without recording it, without taking the notes, and that sort of recalling that experience so well and so clearly?
Okay, so for those who haven't read the book, this is a reference to the night in Beirut, and the head of this Lebanese militia is, I refer to as a sheikh. There are several categories of me writing down or remembering what happened. The first category is a recording, which I then transcribe, usually into Swiss German, so that it can't be traced. The second one is that if I'm able to take notes actually throughout a conversation. And the third one, obviously, is when I have to reconstruct from memory. In the case of these hours in the night in Beirut, where I'm having this conversation with a sheikh, there's a combination of factors. I did afterwards write down, once I reached Istanbul again, everything as I had remembered it. And then there was one of the sheikh's assistants, his actually number 2 guy, also someone sanctioned by the United States, who was with me throughout the night. He actually had come to pick me up in Istanbul and then take me all the way to the sheikh as I was being vetted to see whether he would ultimately decide to take me or not. And when I wrote down out of memory the pieces of conversation as I remembered them, I asked this individual whether I remembered it correctly, because they had consented to me writing this book. I probably wouldn't have been able to write this book if they hadn't consented. So I checked with him, and then I asked Khalid, who knows the sheikh extremely well, when even after checking with this gentleman called Jamil, even if it was still unclear whether my recollection was correct or not, I would ask Khalid to please check with the sheikh too, to make sure I wasn't misquoting him. There was a lot of conversations we had about religion, about Judaism. He knew I was Jewish. He knew that I was a Levi, obviously, from my name. And so he challenged me on a lot of those things. And so it was important to me to get that right. I wouldn't have written it down. And so Khalid then checked with him too. And then to the extent that I had a slightly different memory still of everything, I flagged that in the footnote in the book. And there are several moments, one in particular, where I really feel like I blacked out, where I couldn't remember something, that just there's a 10-minute, I've estimated as a 10-minute episode where my memory is completely dark, black, I should say. And I wrote that in the footnote to say that it's not reliable what I remember from that time. And it was in between conversations with the sheikhs. So it wasn't really about recording them then. And then we get more into my own memory and how it's affected. There are certain things I think I remember pretty well. I've been writing a diary my whole life. I should say since I've been 12 years old. The first time I read the diary of Anne Frank. And she addresses her diary to Kitty. And I've been addressing my diary since my 12th year to Anne Frank, actually. So, spending some time at the end of every day or throughout the day, writing down what happened throughout the day, something I've been doing my whole life, or my whole conscious life, I should say. It comes fairly naturally to write it down, but that obviously doesn't speak to the quality of my recollection. So what I addressed earlier was how I was trying to make sure that my recollection was accurate. When I really couldn't be sure, I either didn't put it in the book or I flagged it as possibly unreliable in the footnote.
Thank you. And thank you also for sharing that insight into you as well, in terms of the keeping a diary, and what an incredible way to honor Anne Frank and her memory as well, and certainly with the work that you're doing and have done to save others. And I know that the situation in Syria, you alluded to this with Captagon, how that's impacted but not just Syria, but how that's spreading as well, and the negative impact that that's having on a global level. But I'm wondering if you could share briefly about how Syria is different from other places in the Middle East. You talked about there are places you're not going to go in, and not just in Syria, but even the way in which you write about different places in the book, there seems to be a little bit more comfort level in other parts of the Middle East than you have in Syria. How is it different, and how is it like all other wars in the Middle East as well?
Beyond all wars being awful, without any exception, Syria has a quality that I had never experienced, both as a combatant myself in the military, and also in just spending time in war zones, and whether that's in the Middle East, in Africa, in Central America and Southeast Asia. Syria has a violence that I had never seen before. There is an element, right now I'm involved in something, for example, in a country in Southeast Asia that sees a lot of violence against civilians, but it has some kind of a rational context for those perpetrating it. As awful as it is, there's still some rational reasoning on why they're doing it. Whereas in Syria, there is this understanding that those with power simply want to burn the country to the ground. I think that there's a sense of a point of no return, and the violence now is the only way that those with power seem to believe that they can be feared. They'll never be loved, they'll never be respected, but at least fear will allow them to live out their life, in the luxury that they've had by amassing these fortunes. And so the violence that you see in Syria, the violence directed against really the most vulnerable of society, the children, the old people, it's something I've never quite seen on this kind of scale. Now, of course, we've had, the 20th century has brought us, and us as a people, violence that we don't need to get into right now. And obviously you've seen, for example, gassings in the Iran-Iraq war, the use of chemical weapons. So we've seen that kind of violence against civilians in other places. But there was always a sense that it would last as long as it was necessary to maintain power. And as hideous and as devastating as it was, there was always that kind of a reasoning. Whereas in Syria, I really do believe that it's just become this absolute zero-sum game. That 10 years ago, Assad said to his population, you either get me or I'll burn the country to the ground. And in the end, they got both. He stayed and he burned his country to the ground. And then the reasons for that are really multifaceted. I don't think I can touch on them all adequately, but one of the things that struck me in meeting Assad several times was that just how unbelievably insecure he felt as a person, insecure about everything, about the fact that he's a slight lisp, to the fact that his Arabic is inadequate, to the fact that he's an incidental president because it should have been his older brother who ended up crashing in a car accident just before his Hafiz al-Assad, the father, passed away. So he's this accidental president who I think is spending his entire life trying to prove that he's as tough as everyone else. And as a result is forgetting that even exacting violence has to have some kind of a purpose. Even in the most gruesome totalitarian of regimes, you take North Korea, take whatever country you want to look at, there was always some kind of a context, even some kind of a dogma. Even the violence against the Jewish people in Nazi Germany had a dogma behind it that doesn't make it any less hideous, but at least there is in that warped thinking some kind of a linear understanding to that. In Syria, I feel like that's not there anymore. It's counterintuitive. Now Assad is destroying the country that he claims he's going to want to have to rebuild because he wants to be president of a legitimate country again. So I had never experienced this kind of violence in little 5-year-old boys taken on their way home from school and just tortured to death in the back of a police van, where you don't really understand, other than just creating this, not just fear, but this hatred. I just really never understood what the point of it was. Even if you want to be feared, you want to be feared for a particular purpose. Whereas in the Syrian context, the impression that I got over the years was the fear was the end. It wasn't just a means to an end. It was really just the end. And I didn't, that takes it to a completely different level. I've seen the repression in other countries. I've experienced it in Iran. I've seen it in all parts of the world. But there was always a rational thinking behind it, sort of a transition plan, and some kind of a, as Tom Friedman always says, the day after, right? What's your plan ultimately for that? It may be a very ugly way of thinking, a criminal way of thinking, but there was always some kind of a plan for the day after. In Syria, I don't think it's that. I just think everyone's settled into the fact that there's going to be violence for the foreseeable future. And the craziest part of the whole thing is that in recent weeks, Assad is actually being readmitted into what we would consider polite society. Syria is now, you can't even make up this kind of irony. Syria is a member of the World Health Organization's board. I mean, I don't even know where to begin, and I don't want to politicize the United Nations in our conversation, but that's the kind of stuff where you start to realize that global diplomacy, as we look at it, really just doesn't make a whole lot of sense anymore. And so then we get into all this kind of realpolitik reasoning, whether it's smart to allow King Abdullah in Jordan out of his position of weakness to reopen the door to Assad, and through that back door readmit Assad to polite society. And is that in Israel's interest? Is that the enemy of my enemy kind of thinking, or the ally of my friend? And once you get into that kind of unsophisticated and valueless kind of thinking, then the violence makes even less sense. As Assad's being admitted into this, let's call it polite society, and we're being very generous with that term, even as he's being readmitted, the violence hasn't abated. And so in that case, you start to ask yourself, what exactly is the point of that violence? If he really has no plans for ever rebuilding that country, what was this war really all about? And then it leaves you as a complete cynic, ultimately, which is why, again, Syria, and our foundation is very active right now in Yemen and in Libya, as an example. And they're very hard to deal with, both countries, for different reasons. Yemen, an extremely tribal society. It's very hard to get people to agree to a coherent kind of national consensus. Libya with its own challenges. And you see how much Gaddafi, even ethically and morally, has destroyed his country over 30 years. But you still sense that there is a common yearning towards, at some point, having something close to a functional country, whether that's going to happen or not. In Syria, you don't really see that. It's really just an utter destruction for the sake of the utter destruction. And that makes it even harder to be active there. It's among the reasons, again, where you asked me earlier why I wrote the book. That's a door I'm really happy to close.
And even in closing it, you inspire. One of the things that was so incredibly moving to me was the postscript. And that was before I knew that you dedicate your daily journaling and diary to Anne Frank and to her memory. But one of the things that as Jews we talk about, and we remember that we were slaves in Egypt. We vow not to forget and to continue to tell the stories of those who perished during the Holocaust, and to remember and to speak up for the voiceless. And it is one of the messages at the heart of Judaism, is this responsibility to be that voice in the world, and to L'taken olam, to try to repair the world. And you ask in that postscript, and I don't think this is giving anything away, but you ask who cares, and you go through the story. You just share a handful. I mean, and it's a large number of different experiences of people who have been victims of the Syrian regime, and who have been whose families have been devastated by such loss and suffering. And I know I can imagine those are only a handful. It's the same way that we only know as many of the stories of our own people in the Holocaust. We only know the stories that have been written, and that have been told, and that have been shared and passed down. And so you're sharing those stories with us, and sharing just a little bit of these families and their lives. And clearly there is much that still needs to be done. And many of us might wonder, well, what can we do? I'm not going over I'm certainly not going to Syria. I'm not going to be able to help even close to in the same way that you've been able to. But what, for those who might want to get involved, whose interest is piqued, or who are inspired to do something to speak up or to help all those who are suffering in Syria, what can we do from the comfort of our own homes, whether on this rainy day or another one? We might not have the same skills, connection, or even courage that you've displayed, but there must be something that those of us sitting here who have been moved by these stories can do to help.
I'm in no position to dispense that kind of advice. I think tikkun olam is a really hard concept. Even the fact that we were slaves in Egypt, whether that just was the whole people or just the Levim, and maybe just part of the Levim, which is why we all have Midianite names and so on. So I'm in no position to dish out advice on that. I think tikkun olam, I can only speak for personal experience, works the best when I look at it very modestly as something that I can do in my own immediate surroundings. Obviously, we can talk about getting informed about conflicts such as Syria and support good organizations that help refugees and so on and so on. So you obviously don't need me to wax poetic on that. For me, tikkun olam has the most relevance in my immediate surrounding. It's why I also, when you asked me earlier, why get involved in something like that, it's when someone affects you personally and you can connect that way. It's that kind of personal connection that makes the difference. It's a little bit, even in the messianic concept of the days of Mashiach, when the Messiah will come, it's always this idea that it's always a collective element, right? So you have this barrel full of tears, or this barrel full of water and drops, and at some point, someone's going to shed that one last tear that's going to just tip that barrel, and eventually will be full. But it's just one drop. You can't say that made a difference, and yet it made all the difference, like any other individual drops. And so, to look at it just modestly in our immediate surroundings, you make a difference in Syria if you make a difference with the person you sit next to in the bus. I don't think the moment we trip up is when we start having these grand visions and some kind of visions of a Nobel Prize or some other kind of award or anything like that. When we start to overthink it and think in grand terms, the same thing happens in diplomacy. It usually becomes just empty rhetoric. And there's a lot of virtue signaling that goes into that. And it's not something that I think is correlated to tikkun olam. I think tikkun olam really only happens, at least I can only speak from my personal experience, in very immediate interactions. And so whatever that is, I mean, for most of us, it's not going to be Syria, just as, you have gulags in North Korea. There's nothing I can do about that. It's the same kind of suffering. It's the same souls as you have the ones in Syria. So it's whatever in our immediate circles and surroundings we can make a difference with is where we should do it. And so I don't really connect it to Syria, and I don't, as much as I wanted to tell the story of Syria, and all the individuals that I mentioned in the postscript are real people, and those are their real names. And so it's just to show actually that this is real suffering, and if nothing else, just not to become numb to that kind of suffering, numb to Syria, numb to those kinds of horrific views. And I don't want to politicize this conversation, but certainly, even if we're focused in Israel, we don't really have to look very far to see that maybe we should be a little less numb to sufferings of people in the Middle East itself, in Israel's immediate vicinity. And again, without going too far into that. So there's plenty we can do there in our own circles, without politicizing it, without falling into one camp or another camp. Anyone with whatever makes him or her comfortable.
Daniel, thank you so much. And what a perfect way for us to conclude as we prepare to enter into Shabbat. And as we think about we take that time and that moment to take a deep breath to reflect on the blessings in our lives, and also to remember, as we do at the end of each Shabbat, that we pause and think about the possibility for bringing wholeness into the world, and the possibility that maybe that one last tear will be shed, that maybe through our hands and the work that we do, that we can help to bring about that time and truly come to welcome the Mashiach. But for now, I hope everyone has enjoyed this time together, and certainly given us some good food for thought and conversation on this rainy, cool day. And Daniel, we're so grateful to you, and thank you again for sharing your book, Proof of Life. And the link to the book is in the chat through our mitzvah mall, so you can support the ways in which we at Washington Hebrew are each day trying to work to repair the world, to tikkun olam. And I hope again that you'll join us this evening as we install Cantor Bortnick. And really, Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, for sharing a precious piece of yourself with us. And we hope that the next time we get to see you, perhaps even in person, and I don't know how often you're down here in Washington, but we hope that when you are, that you'll come and share some time with us in person as well. So thank you.
My daughter lives in Washington now, so who knows?
Ah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, if she needs anything, we're here for her as well, so you can let her know that. And we wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. We thank the Jewish Book Council. I thank all of you for taking the time and for being here, and certainly Daniel Levin. We're so pleased to have you, and thank you again.
Thank you.